April 8, 1943, North Atlantic. 0300 hours. The sea was black glass under a crescent moon. U-333, a Type 7C submarine, cut through the calm surface like a steel serpent. Its commander, Captain Lieutenant Peter Kramer, stood on the conning tower, his oilskin coat glistening with salt spray. The air bit at his face as he scanned the horizon, a dark void broken only by the rhythmic pulse of the diesels below. For days, the U-boat had stalked the shipping lanes southwest of Iceland, hunting the convoys that kept Britain alive. But tonight something was wrong. The radio operator below had intercepted frantic Morse chatter. Convoy HX-231 was under escort by new long-range air cover. The phrase chilled Kramer more than any gale. He'd heard the rumors. Allied aircraft that could stay aloft for 16 hours, sweeping hundreds of miles of ocean. The B-24 Liberator, they called it. A heavy bomber turned hunter equipped with radar and depth charges. No U-boat was safe, not even in the mid-Atlantic gap that once served as their sanctuary. Still, the ocean was vast and Kramer trusted the night. He turned to his first officer, Oberleutnant José Weber, a gaunt man with eyes sunken from weeks without rest. "Surface run until 400, Kramer ordered. "Then we dive and wait for dawn." Weber nodded, jotting it down on the bridge log. The diesel engines hummed louder as the boat pushed eastward. Beneath their boots, the deck vibrated with mechanical life. Inside, men slept in bunks no wider than their shoulders, dreaming of land, warmth, and silence. Then, faintly, a sound. A distant rising hum that didn't belong to the sea. Kramer froze, his gloved hand tightening around his binoculars. The wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable droning of engines, not one but several. He snapped his gaze skyward. At first there was only the faintest blur in the stars. Then they appeared, silhouettes growing larger, spreading across the heavens like steel-winged predators. Alarm. The shout tore through the conning tower. Men scrambled from below as the klaxon wailed. Kramer's heart slammed in his chest. He didn't need to count them. He could see the formation. 5, 6, maybe more aircraft sweeping in from the west, the moonlight glinting off their bellies. Diving stations. Schnell! The crew hurled themselves through the hatch, sealing it behind them. The diesels died, replaced by the electric motor's hum as seawater rushed over the hull. The U-boat slipped beneath the surface just as the first bombs began to fall. The ocean convulsed. Columns of white water rose above the periscope depth, pounding the sub like the fists of gods. Inside, gauges rattled, lights flickered, and the metallic groan of the pressure hull filled every man's ears. Kramer gripped the periscope stand, jaw clenched. "Down to 60 meters.
Level off."
The helmsman obeyed, sweat beading on his forehead. The sonar operator pressed his headset tight, calling out bearings. "Multiple contacts above. Circling." Depth charges exploded in rhythmic terror. Each blast felt closer, heavier, until one thundered so near that dust and rust showered from the ceiling. The lights died. For a few agonizing seconds there was only the sound of the sea and the men's labored breathing. Then as the last rumble faded, silence reclaimed the deep. Kramer exhaled, his voice barely a whisper. "They found us." In that moment it was clear. The Atlantic was no longer theirs. The silence inside U-333 was suffocating. The red emergency lights barely illuminated the narrow control room. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, sweat and diesel fumes mixing into a metallic stench. Condensation beaded on every surface, dripping like rain in reverse. Somewhere aft, a pump groaned as it fought back seawater forced through tired seals. Kramer steadied himself against the chart table, forcing calm into his voice. "Report damage." The chief engineer, Obermaschinenrat Richter, wiped blood from a cut above his eye. Starboard battery rack took a shock. No flooding. Trim tanks holding. He paused, listening to the hull creak around them. "We were damn lucky, Herr Kapitän." Lucky. Kramer hated the word. The ocean didn't deal in luck and only skill, instinct, and timing. From the sonar station, Matrosengerfreiter Kruger suddenly straightened. "Hydrophone contact." Multiple screw noises. "They're still above us." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Aircraft used to strike and leave, swooping down like falcons, then disappearing into the clouds. But these new planes didn't vanish. They lingered. They were patient. They could track a U-boat for hours. Kramer whispered the name like a curse. Liberators. The B-24s didn't rely on luck either. They had ASV Mark III radar, able to pierce the darkness and detect a U-boat conning tower miles away. Worse, some now carried a secret weapon called Lee Light, a blinding spotlight used during surprise night attacks. The era of safety on the surface was over. Kremer gripped the periscope and raised it slowly, careful not to break the surface too abruptly. The lens breached for a second, and that second was enough. The sky was crawling with aircraft, not just one. Not just a patrol. A whole formation moving in wide circles over the ocean, disciplined, relentless. Their bellies glinted with racks of depth charges. One plane banked sharply, and Kremer saw the long silhouette of a Liberator framed against the moon. Every instinct in him screamed. He lowered the periscope as the sub shuddered. Another detonation. Farther this time. The hull flexed, groaning like a living thing. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. Kremer didn't look at them. He couldn't afford doubt. He turned to Weber. "We go deeper. 120 meters. Rig for silent running." The announcement rippled through the boat. Motors slowed to a whisper. Every sound became deliberate. No talking, no unnecessary movement. Even shoes were removed to soften footsteps. Electric power only. The air grew warmer, and still the B-24s circled. Kruger leaned into his microphone again. New sound. Faster rotation. Multiple splashes. Kremer's stomach dropped. Sonobuoys. The Allies were dropping underwater listening devices. Floating hydrophones tuned to detect the faintest noise. "Hold depth," Kremer ordered softly. The U-boat coasted into darkness. Men listened to the sea the way soldiers listen for distant gunfire. Then, the unmistakable metallic echo of screws passed overhead. One aircraft, two, three, they weren't leaving. Kremer's face tightened. The U-boat war had always been built on ambush, mobility, and visibility. But now here they were, trapped below, hunted from above, unable to surface and recharge batteries without risking annihilation. Weber leaned close, voice barely a breath. "They're forcing us under until we suffocate." Kremer didn't respond immediately. He thought of the 1,000 U-boat sailors who had already disappeared beneath the waves, men who believed the Atlantic belonged to them. But tonight, he had seen the truth. The sky ruled the sea. He finally spoke so quietly only Weber could hear. "No ocean is wide enough if the enemy owns the sky." The pressure hull popped in protest, a deep, resonant thump from the outer plates. The battle was no longer hunter versus prey. It was prey versus the inevitable. Hours passed. Inside U-333, time stretched into something cruel. The sub held at 120 meters, deeper than Kremer liked. They were near the edge of what the hull could tolerate. Every creak sounded like the beginning of a rupture. The men no longer looked at the clock. They watched the battery gauge, slowly dropping. Weber whispered, "Batteries at 50%. That number hung in the air like a death sentence. The U-boat had two options: stay submerged and suffocate when batteries died, surface and meet the Liberators. Kremer closed his eyes for a moment, the dim red glow turning the inside of his eyelids into blood. He thought of earlier war years, 1941, 1942, when surfacing meant fresh air, a cigarette on the bridge, and freedom. Back then, U-boats owned the Atlantic. Wolf packs tore through convoys while escorts struggled in the dark. But the sky had changed everything. Kruger stiffened at the hydrophone. Multiple propellers. Fast, one diving. Kremer snapped to alert. A diving sound from the hydrophone meant one thing. A Liberator was lining up for another attack. Hold course, silent running. No one breathed. No one dared to swallow too loudly. The air was thick with fear, a tangible thing pressing into their lungs. The bomber passed overhead, and then clink, clink, clink. Objects dropping into the water. Sonobuoys again. The Allies were building a cage around them. Then a new noise, a steady mechanical tone, began pulsing through the hydrophones. Kruger's eyes widened. He whispered, "They're signaling each other, coordinating." These aircraft weren't just hunting, they were orchestrating. Above, the surface erupted, depth charges detonating in a descending pattern, walking toward the submarine in a methodical, merciless rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. The hull shook violently. A light bulb shattered, spraying glass. Somewhere aft, a man screamed as a valve burst and scalding water sprayed across his arm. Chief Engineer Richter shouted, "Pressure spike in the stern, bulkhead flexing." Kremer steadied himself. "Compensate with forward trim, keep the bow down." Another blast tore through the depths closer than before. The shockwave hit like a fist, slamming men into walls. The floor pitched underneath them. Tools clattered off shelves. Someone vomited. Kremer clung to the periscope mount. The boat settled again. He looked around at his crew, faces pale, sunken, eyes full of fatigue and terror. These were men who'd gone to sea believing they were hunters. Now they were prey. Weber approached him, voice low. "Herr Kapitän, we must break contact. If we stay silent, they'll run us to the bottom." Kremer's jaw tightened. He hated it, hated that he was even considering surfacing. But the Liberators weren't leaving. They had fuel. They had radar. They had the sea and the sky. And U-333 had a shrinking battery and no oxygen reserves. Minutes passed as Kremer weighed the impossible against the inevitable. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cold. The air was stale, hot with breath and fear. Finally, he spoke. "We will go to 90 meters. Ahead slow. Change course 10 degrees to starboard. 1 knot only." The men exchanged exhausted glances. 1 knot wasn't movement. It was drifting. But drifting quietly was their only chance. Kruger listened intently. One aircraft moving west. Others staying overhead, still caged. Kremer took a slow breath. He had one card left, something every U-boat commander dreaded using, the crash surface maneuver. "The moment batteries reach 20%, he whispered, "we surface and engage them with the flak guns." Every head snapped toward him. That was suicide. The U-boat's twin 20mm cannons and single 37mm gun were terrifying against a lone patrol plane. Against multiple Liberators, it was like bringing a knife to a machine gun fight. Yet Kremer knew they had no choice. If they didn't fight on the surface, they would die beneath it. Richter swallowed hard. Understood. Kremer looked at his men, his brothers in iron and salt. He saw a mixture of dread and grim resolve. U-boat crews weren't bred for surrender. He leaned close to Weber. "Prepare the bridge guns, but be ready. We surface only on my order." Weber nodded. The boat continued its silent drift through black water. Batteries at 30%. Batteries at 25%. Kruger whispered, "Herr Kapitän. New contact. Very faint. Could be another aircraft joining the pattern." Kremer didn't flinch. He simply stared at the depth gauge. Meters. 100 meters. The hull groaned, complaining at being driven too deep for too long. Then, Richter spoke again. "Batteries at 20%. The needle crossed the line. Kremer inhaled, steady and controlled. "All hands, prepare to surface." The men moved like ghosts. Silent, resigned. Men who had spent weeks with the ocean as their ally now faced it as their executioner. Kremer gripped the ladder leading to the conning tower. "When the hatch opens," he whispered, "we fight." He placed his hand on the wheel of the hatch. The U-boat surged upward. The U-boat rose like a dying beast. Kremer braced against the conning tower ladder as compressed air flooded the ballast tanks. The hull groaned, then began its upward tilt. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Men clung to valves and handrails as the bow lifted. Every heartbeat felt like counted seconds until judgment. At 20 meters depth, sounds from above bled into the boat. The muffled roar of engines, the chop of waves. Then something sharper, machine gun fire. The Liberators were strafing the surface. "Final checks," Richter shouted. Sweat dripped from his chin as he held onto a pipe. "Batteries at 17%. Diesel ready." Kramer forced steel into his voice. "On surface, get the diesels running immediately. Flak crew topside for combat, everyone else remains at stations." He climbed into the conning tower with Weber at his heels. The boat surged upward like a missile seeking air. The diving planes above closed in. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The pounding on the hull wasn't depth charges anymore. It was heavy machine gun rounds stitching across the sea, chewing the ocean into froth. 5 meters. 2 meters. Surface. Salt water exploded off the bow as the Atlantic swallowed the boat's emergence in a roar of spray. The conning tower tore through the waves and Kremer spun the hatch wheel. Cold night air crashed into his lungs. He hauled himself onto the bridge, boots slipping on the wet steel decking. The moment he cleared the hatch, the sky erupted, at least 6 aircraft. 1 Liberator dead ahead, lights off, 2 on its wings. 3 more circling wider. They moved like vultures who had waited too long for the kill. "Weber! Guns!" Kremer shouted. The flak crew scrambled up behind him, sprinting to the twin 20mm cannons on the bridge platform. Another sailor swung into position at the 37mm gun aft. The Liberators came in low. Kremer grabbed the voice tube. "Diesels! Full power! Zigzag pattern! Hard port!" The diesels roared to life beneath him, coughing out black fumes as the U-boat lurched forward. The men at the guns racked their magazines and opened fire. Braka, 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 braka. The 20mm flak spat fire into the dark sky. Tracer rounds arced upward, orange streaks cutting through the night as the first Liberator swooped down along their port beam. Kremer saw its underbelly, the bulbous radar dome, the bay doors yawning open, and the unmistakable shape of depth charges inside. "Hit the cockpit," Weber yelled. The 37mm gun thundered, its recoil shaking the platform. Sparks erupted from the bomber's wing root. One of its engines coughed black smoke. For a heartbeat, a cheer rose. Then the second plane dove in. Bright, blinding incandescent light snapped on. A lee light, flooding the U-boat in harsh white brilliance. The ocean around them turned to daylight. Kremer's pupils constricted painfully. "No cover. Take it down." The flak opened up again. Tracers hammered at the bomber's nose turret, clanging off armor plating. The Liberator held steady, its light burning straight into their eyes. Then something fell, a depth charge, released from 20 meters. Kremer screamed into the voice tube, "Hard starboard, full rudder." The U-boat heeled violently, nearly throwing him over the rail. The charge hit the water just off the stern. Whoomph, the detonation lifted the entire boat. Men slammed onto the deck. One flak gunner was flung against the railing, his body limp, sliding into the sea, gone instantly. Salt water sprayed high enough to sting Kremer's face like needles. He wiped his eyes and found the flak crew already reloading. Men born for machinery, raised in steel, refusing fear. The battered Liberator pulled away, trailing smoke, but there were more. A third plane dived in, guns blazing. Rounds tore into the conning tower. Metal shrieked. Weber staggered but held to the railing. "Hit! Hit near aft gun!" Someone screamed below. Kremer's voice was pure command. "Keep firing until we jam." The 20mm cannons rattled. A burst of fire stitched across the bomber's fuselage. A fuel line ruptured. Flames streamed behind its wingtip like a comet tail. But even burning, the Liberator released its payload. 3 depth charges. No time to evade. Whoomph, whoomph, whoomph. All 3 detonations slammed the hull. Internal lights flickered below decks. The boat slowed, engines choking out. Richter's voice carried from below through the speaking tube, cracked with panic. "Herr Kapitän, hit to the exhaust housing, starboard diesel stalling." Kremer's eyes scanned the horror around. Them. Flames on the sea surface, flak guns overheating, crew covered in salt and blood. He saw the 4th Liberator lining up. They were not the hunters anymore. They were surrounded, exhausted, crippled. Kremer tightened his grip on the rail. "Prepare to dive, now." Weber stared at him. "If we dive, they'll box us with charges. If we stay up and we die to guns," Kremer's jaw set, "we choose the sea." He leaned into the hatch, roaring down into the boat. "Crash dive. All hands. Dive, dive, dive." The hatch clanged shut, sealing them away from the flak and the stars. Cold water cascaded over the conning tower as U-333 slid beneath the waves. The sudden silence after the gunfire felt unreal, like stepping from a burning building into a tomb. Kremer dropped the hatch wheel into place and slid down the ladder into the control room. Men scrambled past him, drenched, bleeding, wild-eyed. The boat tilted sharply downward as ballast tanks flooded. Level her off at 80 meters, Kramer barked. The helmsman wiped blood from his cheek with a trembling hand. Ahead slow. Diving to 80 meters, the angle flattened. The deck steadied. Then the explosions began again. Crump, crump, crump. 3 charges staggered precise. The hull shuddered. Pipes rattled. A fuse box sparked and died. In the bow torpedo room, a man was thrown against the bunks and lay still. Blood seeping from his ear. The boat groaned like something alive that wanted to scream. Weber braced himself against the chart table. They waited for us. They knew we'd dive. Kramer didn't answer. He stood rigid, listening. Another set of charges exploded, closer. A metallic shriek filled the compartment as a seam somewhere forward stretched to its limit. Men flinched, expecting the rush of seawater. The hull held. Richter burst into the control room, coughing through diesel fumes. His voice was raw and hoarse. Starboard exhaust manifold is cracked. Diesel won't start again without repairs, meaning they could no longer surface to outrun the aircraft. A death sentence in slow motion. Kruger hunched over the hydrophone, eyes distant. Multiple aircraft still overhead. 6. They're laying sonobuoys in a circle. A trap. Kramer leaned over him. Any gap? Kruger swallowed hard. No, Herr Kapitän. They've boxed us in. The crew's breathing tightened. Silence thicker than pressure filled the room. Kramer's mind raced. They couldn't stay submerged. Air and batteries were draining fast. But surfacing again would be suicide. The Liberators were not hunting, they were herding, forcing the U-boat under until its lungs collapsed. Weber broke the silence. Options? Kramer stared at the depth gauge. The needle hovered at 80 meters. The hull creaked under strain. We go deeper, he said. Richter looked horrified. Deeper? Herr Kapitän, the crush depth. I know the numbers. Kramer's voice was steel. If we stay at this level, they triangulate and kill us anyway. We can survive their pattern if we break beneath their predicted depth. Richter swallowed his fear. Aye. We'll redistribute ballast. Kramer addressed the control room quietly but firmly. Listen. We will descend to 160 meters. Silent running. No talking. No movement unless ordered. If a charge detonates close, hold the bulkheads until they stop groaning. We ride the water like a feather. Understand? Men nodded. No one spoke. The bow dipped. The depth gauge needle slid downward. And meters. 100 meters. The lights dimmed as systems were cut to conserve power. The submarine became a drifting coffin in black water. Men could hear their own heartbeats. 30 meters, Richter whispered. This is beyond operational spec. The hull began to moan, a long drawn-out wail. Rivets squealed. The steel bulkheads flexed inward, visible to the naked eye. The ocean was squeezing them. Kramer put a hand on the cool steel wall, as if to steady the boat itself. 50 meters. Salt water seeped from a seam, dripping steadily onto the deck. Kruger suddenly spoke. Aircraft are moving. They're confused. They think we're still at 80 meters. A pulse of hope fluttered through the room. Then, whoomph! A depth charge detonated far above. Not close, not dangerous, just a distant echo. Another followed. Then another. All above them, they had slipped under the kill pattern. Richter exhaled shakily. We outran the pattern. Weber leaned over the plotting table, whispering, If we conserve battery, how long do we have? Richter checked the gauge. The dim red needle trembled near the bottom. 3 hours, maybe 4. 3 hours until suffocation. Kramer looked at his men, at their exhausted eyes and bleeding hands. The pride, the defiance, seemed still there. But beneath it, exhaustion. They had been underwater for so long that the stale air tasted like rust. The submarine creaked again. Louder. Weber spoke quietly. We can't stay. We'll have to try the surface again. At dawn, Kramer nodded slowly. At dawn, the aircraft returned to base. Fuel limits them. It wasn't guaranteed. Nothing about this was guaranteed. But it was the only opening. Hours dragged by. Men dozed, standing up. The air grew thick and sour. A sailor vomited and wiped his face with a sleeve. Others stared at the hull, listening to every sound. Finally, Richter approached. Batteries at 5%. Kramer addressed the crew. Prepare to surface quietly. No. Ightsome, the boat eased upward. Slowly. Carefully. Meters. The ballast tanks hissed as air forced water. Out the bow lifted, the U-boat broke the surface. Night greeted them. Cold, silent, Khmer climbed the conning tower ladder and opened the hatch. The sky was empty. No aircraft. No roar of engines, only the wind. Men emerged onto the deck, gasping as if tasting the world for the first time. Khmer looked at the horizon. The east was paling, the first sign of dawn. The Atlantic stretched out like a sheet of hammered steel. Weber joined him on the bridge. We survived the night. Khmer didn't smile. We survived a night. He looked into the endless sky, but not the war. April 9th, 1943. The Mid-Atlantic Gap. Once the safest hunting ground in the world. The horizon brightened into shades of weak silver and pale rose as dawn crept over the ocean. U-333's conning tower sat low in the water, bruised and battered, streaked with salt and soot. Spray froze in crystalline beads on the railing. To an outside observer, she might have looked triumphant, a predator returning from a night of battle. But Khmer knew better. She was a survivor. Barely. Khmer stood on the bridge beside Weber. Both men were hollow-eyed, uniforms stiff with dried seawater and oil. The sea breeze cut through the exhaustion, but it couldn't chase away the tension. Behind them, a diesel coughed and stuttered as Richter coaxed it back to life. The engine room was a nightmare of bent piping, cracked manifolds, and exhausted men working with bleeding hands. The air reeked of fuel. Khmer scanned the empty sky again. Still no aircraft, but he no longer trusted emptiness. The sky felt deceitful, as if merely catching its breath before the next assault. Weber kept his voice low. We were lucky. Khmer didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. No, they let us live. Their fuel ran out. He tapped his binoculars against the railing. If they had enough range, we would be metal and bones on the seabed. Weber fell silent. They both knew it was true. A year ago, U-boats had ruled these waters. The wolf pack had torn into convoys like hungry sharks. Allied ships died in flames, and the U-boat crews celebrated each sinking as another step toward starvation of the British Isles. But now, the hunters had become the hunted. Kruger climbed up to the bridge, still pale from hours at the hydrophones. He handed the message slate to Khmer. Radio intercept from BDU, Herr Kapitän. Khmer flipped it open. Urgent, U-boat losses increasing. New Allied aircraft closing Mid-Atlantic Gap. Avoid surface during daylight. Operate submerged when possible. Do not risk engagement unless certain of escape. Weber read over his shoulder. They're telling us to avoid the surface during daylight. That's madness. We can't charge batteries if we stay down. They know, Khmer replied flatly. The message was not strategy, it was desperation. Kruger hesitated. There's more, sir. Khmer read the postscript. U-boat command estimates survival chances in mid-Atlantic significantly reduced. He closed the slate. For the first time in the war, BDU, U-boat headquarters, was admitting the truth. The Atlantic was slipping from their control. By mid-morning, Richter emerged from below, his face streaked with grime. Starboard diesel is running. Barely. We can make 6 knots, Khmer looked at him. 6 knots won't outrun anything. No, sir, Richter replied softly. But it's the best she can give. Khmer nodded once. That will do. He leaned over the chart table, tracing their path back toward the French coast. The distance looked obscene, thousands of kilometers through air-patrolled water. If the Liberators found them again during daylight, U-333 would not survive a second engagement. Weber pointed at the planned route. Should we risk a submerged transit during the day? Khmer hesitated only a moment. The decision cost him something inside. Yes, we surface only at night. Weber stared. At this rate, we'll take 2 weeks to reach Lorient. Khmer folded the chart and clipped it down. Then we take 2 weeks. The next night, they ran the diesels again, slow, cautious, submerged by day, creeping on the surface at night. The crew slept in shifts, haunted by the memory of explosions and the crushing pressure of the deep. Any sudden vibration made them flinch. A dropped wrench in the engine room felt like a bomb to tired nerves. 3 days later, during a brief surface run, a lookout spotted a Liberator silhouette far off, nothing more than a dark cross against the clouds. Khmer ordered an immediate dive. The bomber never turned toward them. It probably never saw them, But the message was clear. The Atlantic no longer belonged to submarines. That evening, a coded radio broadcast crackled through the hull. It came from U-Boat Command in Lorient. Kramer read it twice before handing it to Weber. April 14, 1943, Admiral Karl. Dunitz orders all U-boats to avoid the North Atlantic convoy routes. Losses unsustainable. Aircraft coverage too extensive. Weber looked up. They're pulling us out? Kramer leaned back in his chair, weariness settling into his bones. No, not pulling us out. He placed the message on the chart table. Admitting defeat. The two men stood in silence, listening to the hum of the dying diesel, the soft slosh of seawater against the hull, the metallic pulse of their own heartbeat in the narrow steel tomb. Hours later, when the sea finally calmed and the stars came out, Kramer returned to the bridge alone. He looked at the sky, the same sky that had once meant freedom and navigation. How filled with unseen killers the ocean was ours, he whispered, until the sky filled with wings. He imagined iron crosses beneath the waves, the graves of U-boats that never made it home. Men who died believing the wolf pack would always rule the sea. But wars evolve. Predators become prey, and the ocean keeps its secrets. Kramer rested a hand on the cold steel railing. Never again, he murmured to the sea. Never again will we underestimate the sky. The dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the shattered horizon gold. Far away, U-333 limped toward France. The war and the era of the U-boat was ending.